was just told I have the honor of introducing the discussant, Professor Teresita Levy. She's a good friend of mine. We are colleagues at Lehman College, and we actually share an office at college. But I will read some of the things that Centro has written. She's assistant professor in Latin American and Puerto Rican, Latino and Puerto Rican studies at Lehman College.
No se oye.
No se oye.
No, it's on.
Turn it on.
Just gotta talk into it. It's on. Talk into the mic.
It's on?
Yeah.
Now you go.
So I'm introducing my colleague and friend Teresita Levy. She's assistant professor in Latin American, Latino, and Puerto Rican studies at Lehman College, and she earned her PhD in history from CUNY's Graduate Center with a dissertation on tobacco cultivation in Puerto Rico during the early part, the first half of the 20th century. And that dissertation was expanded and turned into a book, a very popular book that is published by Rutgers University Press, and I do encourage you to get it and to read it. Professor Levy at Lehman teaches courses mostly on history of Puerto Rico, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Latino studies, and it's a great asset to the department. She's also one of the nicest persons I know, so I'll leave you with her.
Gracias, Javier. I paid him well for that. It's so nice to be here at Centro, a place that I love and that has been really important in my development as a scholar and as a student of Puerto Rico. And it is my honor and pleasure, real pleasure, to introduce you tonight to Dr. Jorge Duany, Director of the Cuban Research Institute and Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies in the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University. Born in Cuba and raised in Panama and Puerto Rico, Dr. Duany previously served as Acting Dean of the College of Social Sciences, Professor of Anthropology, Chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and Director of the journal Revistas de Ciencias Sociales at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. He has held visiting research and teaching appointments at several U.S. universities, including Harvard, Connecticut, Wisconsin, Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and the City University of New York. He earned his PhD in Latin American Studies, specializing in anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. He also holds an MA in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago and a BA in Psychology from Columbia University. Dr. Duany has published extensively on migration, ethnicity, race, nationalism, and transnationalism in Cuba, the Caribbean, and the United States. He has also written about Cuban cultural identity on the island and in the diaspora, especially as expressed in literature, music, and religion. He has belonged to the editorial boards of academic journals such as Cuban Studies, Latino Studies, Centro, Caribbean, Latin American, and Caribbean Ethnic Studies, and New West Indian Guide. He is the author, co-author, and editor of many books, among them, not the one that we're talking about tonight, but also Un Pueblo Disperso, Dimensiones Sociales y Culturales de la Diáspora Cubana in 2014, Blurred Borders, Transnational Migration Between the Hispanic Caribbean and the United States in 2011, La Nación en Vaivén, Identidad, Migración y Cultura Popular en Puerto Rico in 2010, How the United States Racializes Latinos, White Hegemony and Its Consequences in 2009, The Puerto Rican Nation on the Move, Identities on the Island and in the United States in 2002, and Cubans in Puerto Rico, Ethnic Economy and Cultural Identity in 1997, among many, many others. Since February of 2003, Dr. Duany writes a monthly editorial column for the newspaper El Nuevo Día, what I think is among the most insightful and interesting writing in that paper. In 2010, he received the Bolívar Pagan Prize in Journalism from the Institute of Puerto Rican Literature. So this list of accomplishments, it's impressive, right?
Yes.
But it does not at all demonstrate the impact that Jorge has had on the scholarship of migration, ethnicity, race, nationalism, and transnationalism. And from now on, I'll just call him Jorge, because we just should. His work has been groundbreaking and has often pushed the conversation about a particular topic to a more profound intellectual level, all while keeping the voices of the actors central to the discussion. So he may tell you, and he may really explain, eloquently the theoretical framework of transnationalism, for example, in the case of Puerto Rico, but he will also include how Puerto Ricans themselves have articulated being Puerto Rican throughout time. And that is not easy. This book is no different that we're going to talk about tonight, and it is perhaps the best, most complete, considering that it's only a brief 173 pages, introduction to the island and its diaspora. Jorge will tell you about the book, so I won't. But suffice it to say that scattered among a telling of the major historical, political, social, and cultural events occurring both in the island and the diaspora are the loud and constant voices of Puerto Ricans on the island and the mainland, defining their present and envisioning their future. Again, the merits of his scholarship, and there are many, do not tell you enough about who Jorge is as a human being, and it will be my honor, as your commentator tonight, to tell you how esteemed he is among colleagues and friends, many who I see and are here tonight. Jorge has been a mentor, a constructive critic, a supporter, a cheerleader, a friend, and sometimes even a parent to many of us. Jorge is gracious and generous, quick with a kind word and a smile. And I'm going to give you a personal example of his graciousness, even in the most awkward of professional situations. So Jorge is married to Diana Johnson, who was my solfeggio teacher for close to 13 years in Puerto Rico. And I remember when I was 15, Diana, who was probably in her 20s, was the ultimate star, right? She was gorgeous, she's brilliant, she was just the coolest woman that we knew. We all wanted to be like her. By the way, I still want to be just like her. So all of a sudden there was talk that she had this boyfriend, right? This boyfriend. And we were so excited because we were 15, and of course this is very exciting. And as 15-year-olds are, sometimes capable of doing, we were unbelievably annoying about this boyfriend. But we couldn't get her to tell us anything at all about him. He was a mystery. And we tried. We really did try. For years we tried. She was a tomb. She never said anything at all. So fast forward 20 years, probably. And while attending a Cuban Research Institute conference when I was still a PhD student, I noticed that Jorge Duany, the great Jorge Duany, was sitting behind me, right? So Jorge was already a star, and you can just imagine how excited I was that I was just there as a student, and he was right behind me, and I was just gonna have the opportunity to meet Jorge Duany, right? And I happened, seriously, it was one of those casualidades, right? I had Jorge's book, Puerto Rican Nation on the Move, with me, and I quickly looked through it because I wanted to make a good impression, and I wanted to have something intelligent to say when I introduced myself, because I was determined that I was going to introduce myself. So of course, I only make it through the dedication page because I read that the book was dedicated to Herminia Guerra Renzoli. I read it a few times just to make sure that it was correct. You see, Herminia Guerra Renzoli, or Minita, as we all knew her, was an accomplished pianist. And it was her conservatory that I attended all of those years and where I took solfeo with Diana. Minita was Diana's mother, and she was my piano teacher. And no one else in the entire world could be named Herminia Guerra Renzoli, right? So it had to be her, So I turn around to Jorge and I say, hola, you're Jorge Duany, right? And he looks at me and very kindly nods and says, yes. And I say, so nice to meet you, mucho gusto, I'm Teresita Levy. Is this Herminia Guerra Renzoli de Minita in San Juan? And he looks at me and he nods and graciously, again, says, nice to meet you, Teresita. so I then ask him how it was that he knew Minita. And again, graciously and patiently this time, said to me, well, I am married to her daughter, Diana. And in my unique, elegant way, as you can imagine already, I opened my eyes wide and I went, oh my God, you're the mystery boyfriend. So luckily, I think he forgave me, or maybe just forgot, such a non-gracious, non-elegant first impression, and has been a steadfast supporter of my work and a good friend ever since. So I will say one last thing about Jorge, and that is that above all, he is present. Unlike some of us that become distracted by our own work or by the sound of our own voice, as academics sometimes like to do, Jorge is always there. He's always listening. He's always ready with a comment or a question that will challenge you to delve deeper, to think about your arguments and question what it is that you think you know. He is interested, he is curious, and this is evident in every piece of scholarship or journalism that he has penned. Lucky for us, he is here tonight to tell us about his latest book, Puerto Rico, What Everyone Needs to Know. And we will have time for questions at the end, so I will ask that you kindly hold off until then. But without further delay, please join me in welcoming Professor Jorge Duany.
Thank you, Teresita, for your wonderful introduction, for your generous comments. I'm not sure what Diana will say after hearing what you just said, because I know that she will be ashamed of everything, of the wonderful comments that you made. This is not, is it working now? Not working, so what should I do? Is it good?
Yeah.
Talk to the mic. I'm happy to see many friends and colleagues in the audience, including my brother Duany, who happens to look like me a lot. And unfortunately, my sister-in-law Sonia and my nephew Guillermo weren't able to be here. But I also want to recognize a few people in the house, especially Professor Yvette Guzman Zavala, where are you? And John Hinshaw, because they came from Lebanon, Pennsylvania, 3 hours away. So great to see you. It's a great pleasure to be back at Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños because, as Teresita already mentioned, I have conducted a lot of research here at Centro, at the archives, and I have developed extensive professional networks over time. I have been a very proud member of Centro, the journal of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, for many years, headed by Javier Totti, and I thank you also for being here, as well as Professor Edwin Melendez, who has kindly invited me more times than I think he can remember to give talks here. And I have to say a couple of things about, I'll give you a better sense of what the book is about, but there are 2 or 3 places where I did use a lot of the research that I conducted here at the Centro Archives, especially when I talk about the farm labor program, which was for me an important moment in my professional career, coming here and looking at that particular episode of the close to 500,000 people from Puerto Rico who came to the US, especially to the Northeast, to work as farm workers and often went back. And I also remember fondly how I looked at a lot of the archives of the Puerto Rican diaspora, looking for evidence precisely of this issue that Teresita just mentioned, the assertion and transformation of cultural identities in the diaspora. Particularly, I remember a lot of information that was buried in many of the files relating to the hometown associations that Puerto Ricans created in New York and elsewhere since the beginning of their migration history. So I have learned a lot from insightful scholars of Puerto Rico and the diaspora, some of whom I consider good friends. I mentioned a few of them in the preface. And I also want to recognize again Teresita Levy. I want to recognize Felix Matos Rodriguez, who unfortunately couldn't be here, but I hope that he would. That's what you get when you are president of a college. Melissa Fuster, who is going to be visiting us soon, and Iris Lopez are the people that I recognize in the audience that I wanted to mention at least. And there are others, of course, that I rely upon and I have used their work. But the kind of book that we're going to be talking about today is not an academic book per se. It's more of a general audience introduction to Puerto Rico and its diaspora. So you'll see that there aren't any footnotes. I did include a selected bibliography, a suggested reading list, and Iris Lopez, I should have mentioned you as well. I'm sorry. That's what happens when you mention names and you forget. But I did use Professor Lopez's work, especially on women and sterilization in Puerto Rico. So let me tell you a little bit about the book, and what I thought I would do was to take some of the main points in the introduction and also the epilogue. I remember I had a teacher, a Spanish-American teacher that we hated, and that's what he told us to present in class. Just introduction and conclusion, the rest really is the details. So I begin by stating something that should be familiar to many of you, which is that Puerto Rico has a peculiar, if not unique, status within Latin America and the Caribbean. The island was one of the 2 remaining colonies of Spain, along with Cuba, for more than 400 centuries, between 1493 and 1898. And then something curious happened on July 1898. The United States invaded Puerto Rico during the Spanish-Cuban-American War, to be politically correct, and has since dominated the island militarily, politically, and economically. In 1901, the U.S. Supreme Court defined Puerto Rico in that paradoxical phrase that we're still struggling with as foreign to the United States in a domestic sense, because it was neither a state of the Union nor a sovereign republic. Congress granted U.S. citizenship to all residents of Puerto Rico in 1917, but the island remained, and again, this is another phrase that we're working with even today, an unincorporated territory of the United States, which the Supreme Court defined as belonging to, but not a part of the United States. As you know, Puerto Rico became a U.S. Commonwealth or Estado Libre Asociado, something that is not a state, not really associated in Spanish. In 1952, while the U.S. federal government retained jurisdiction in most state affairs, including immigration, citizenship, and many other aspects, trade, of course, and other aspects of state affairs. Although Puerto Rico has a resident commissioner in the U.S. Congress, it has no voting representatives, and Puerto Ricans living on the island cannot vote for the U.S. president or vice president. However, they can participate in presidential primaries as they have for the last few decades. Today, the island's electorate is almost evenly split between supporting Commonwealth and becoming the 51st state of the American Union, and only a small minority advocates independence. U.S. culture pervades the island, from the influence of the English language on the Spanish vernacular to the homegrown varieties of Pentecostal churches and the proliferation of fast food restaurants. Puerto Rico clearly maintains colonial ties with the United States, as evidenced, for instance, in its dependence on massive transfer payments from the federal government to its colossal public debt to U.S. creditors. In some respects, and this I wrote before the more recent developments, so I'll try to update it, the island doesn't quite fit the standard image of colonial societies such as the British and French overseas possessions before World War II. Contemporary Puerto Rico enjoys a relatively large degree of self-government than most classic colonies, and this is where I have to footnote myself, because of course I think the fact that this PROMESA, or the Oversight Control Board, was appointed last year makes it less likely that Puerto Rico would retain any kind of semblance of this autonomy. But the island combines some elements of political autonomy with a relatively high standard of living, again, until at least recently, before the beginning of the economic recession in 2006. And certainly, and this is as an anthropologist I'm most interested in, a very strong sense of national identity. Puerto Rico may well be considered a post-colonial colony because it has a persistent national identity, but little desire for a nation state. And and this nation state, again, is a territory that belongs to, but is not a part of the United States. As an unincorporated territory, Puerto Rico has been exposed to an intense penetration of U.S. capital, commodities, laws, institutions, ideas, and customs, really unequaled in any other place in Latin America and the Caribbean. Yet today, again, I emphasize this point, Puerto Ricans seem to have a stronger sense of national identity than even some Caribbean people who enjoy political independence. Many observers have noted the growing separation between the weakened push for a sovereign government in Puerto Rico over the past few decades, and on the other hand, the assertion of a vibrant culture on the island as manifested in language, literature, the arts, popular music, and sports, among many other areas. So at the beginning of the 21st century, I argue here and elsewhere in other works, Puerto Rico presents an apparent paradox, a stateless nation that has not really assimilated into mainstream US culture. After 119 years of its occupation by the United States, the island remains a Spanish-speaking Afro-Hispanic Caribbean nation. And I would add, because we were talking before informally with Edwin Melendez about the issue of this year being celebrated the 100th anniversary of US citizenship to Puerto Rico. So even then, after the incorporation and the loss of, well, it's a disputed aspect, but the apparent loss of Puerto Rican citizenship, Puerto Ricans still remain Puerto Ricans. And in fact, I think that is the old logo of the Centro de Puertorriqueño, porque seguiremos siendo puertorriqueños. In addition to its unresolved colonial dilemma, Puerto Rico is also a nation on the move, una nación en vaivén, as I've called it in previous work. What I mean by that is that the country has been crisscrossed by people constantly going and coming and returning and circulating between the island and the US mainland. Since the 1940s, and it's actually pretty difficult to quantify how many, but at least 2 million people have moved from the island to the US mainland. And this figure actually becomes even more staggering when one recalls that Puerto Rico, the population of Puerto Rico did not even reach 4 million at the beginning of the 21st century and has continued to decrease ever since then. According to the 2015 census estimate, 61.7% of all people of Puerto Rican origin, whether born or raised in the US, now live in the 50 United States. At the same time, and perhaps less noticeable, the island has received hundreds of thousands of immigrants since the 1960s, primarily returned migrants and their children, often called derisively Ricans in Puerto Rico, and also citizens of other countries, especially the Dominican Republic and Cuba. By the year 2015, 8.1% of the island's inhabitants have been born abroad, including those born in the US mainland of Puerto Rican parentage. By the way, when looking at these numbers from the census, what I noticed too is that in addition to the tremendous growth of the Puerto Rican diaspora from the island to the mainland, there has been a decrease in the return migration flow. So that explains why in the absolute numbers and the net migration figures you have many more people leaving than returning. So maybe the return aspect is something that again hasn't been studied enough in the last few years. The combination of a prolonged exodus together with a large influx of returnees and foreigners makes Puerto Rico arguably a test case of transnationalism, which I know that some colleagues like Carlos Vargas Ramos and Edgardo Melendez have taken an issue with, but I think it's a healthy discussion. I define Puerto Rico as a test case of transnationalism because in the sense of the growth and persistence of social, economic, and political ties across national borders, even though, of course, Puerto Rico is not a nation state. In any case, few other countries of the Caribbean, or even the entire world, have experienced such massive and sustained population displacements over such a long span of time. As we begin with World War II, it's been more than 60 years already. Only 19th century Ireland comes to mind as a historical precedent for the magnitude and persistence of the Puerto Rican diaspora. The growing diversity in the migrants' origins and destinations, I think, challenges the idea that the nation can be defined as a contained and singular territory with its own citizenship, its own language, its own culture and identity. And above all, I think the experience of this long-term diaspora makes it very difficult to maintain that only those who were born and live on the island and speak Spanish can legitimately be called Puerto Rican. In 2016, the US Census estimated that for the first time ever, more persons of Puerto Rican origin were living in the 50 United States than on the island. That year, of course, 2016, also marked the onset of the island's prolonged economic recession, so it's been more than 10 years already, which propelled migration to the United States and probably surpassed the so-called Great Migration of the 1940s and 50s. The displacement of the Puerto Rican population reached record highs during the second decade of this century. According to census estimates, the contemporary Puerto Rican flow may have already surpassed the so-called Great Migration between 1945 and 1965. So just to give you a couple of examples, between 2000 and 2015, the island's population actually decreased from more than 3.7 million to less than 3.5 million and continuing to decline. Largely due to high out-migration rates, although of course fertility and mortality are other demographic factors that need to be taken into account. The US Census Bureau estimates that the island's population will probably decline to less than 3 million by the year 2015. Let me say a few words then in terms of the actual organization of the book. By the way, I didn't choose the subtitle, What Everyone Needs to Know. I think it's a little preposterous because it's part of a larger series. So there's a book about China, a book about Venezuela, and I guess the intention is to sort of catch the attention of the readers and give a general sense of the history, culture, politics, and economy of that particular place. So that's what I tried to do. In addition to the introduction, the book is divided into 6 chapters. And when I was writing, especially the last 2, I realized I couldn't write the book about Puerto Rico without including a substantial portion to the diaspora. And I've actually been critical of earlier work by some very well-known and respectable colleagues like Fernando Pico, for instance, for not doing exactly that. The major exception, I think, in the literature is Cesar Ayala and Rafael Bernabe's book, which does include references to the diaspora during the discussion of the island. So by now, I think it's pretty clear, at least from a demographic perspective, that the 2 chapters are really inseparable. So an overview of the book. It begins with the Spanish colonial period. In one chapter, I tried to describe some of the main trends as I see them in terms of how Puerto Rican culture developed out of the mixture between the Taínos, the Spanish, and the African peoples who blended and settled on the island. Also, I look at the geopolitical role of Puerto Rico within the Spanish Empire and how that impacted the economic aspects and political aspects of the island's history. And I also look at the gradual development of an agricultural economy, specializing in the export of coffee, sugar, and tobacco. Secondly, then I look at the first 5 decades of the U.S. colonial regime, 1898 to 1952, and I look especially at the effort by the colonial government to control both political and economic institutions, as well as to Americanize Puerto Rico's culture and language. And in fact, you might remember that during this early period of time, even the name Puerto Rico was changed to Puerto Rico to make it easier to spell for Anglos, and only in the 1930s did the U.S. Congress changed it back to Puerto Rico. In addition, in this second chapter, I tried to look at how Puerto Ricans resisted this effort to Americanize and to impose a different language and a different culture on them. And in fact, I think the effort largely failed because most Puerto Ricans today on the island are not fluent in the English language and actually have this problem with el difícil, the difficult language. Third and fourth chapters outline the main demographic, economic, and political aspects of contemporary Puerto Rico. I try to clarify for myself and for others how exactly the government, the Commonwealth government works, although again, it's kind of mysterious, and especially in the last couple of years with the economic crisis, the fiscal crisis, as well as the political situation. But the question as to the status, the political status may not be very productive after all, because there are so many other issues that need to be addressed. But clearly it's one of the obsessions, one of the national pastimes on the island. So in the final 2 chapters, I try to summarize what I know and what others know about the mass migration of Puerto Ricans since the mid-20th century, with its ebbs and flows, but certainly in the current moment in which we've seen a resurgence of migration comparable to the 1940s and 50s. And in particular, I'm trying to focus on the multiple demographic, economic, political, and cultural repercussions of this continuing exodus of Puerto Ricans to the U.S. I want to now jump briefly, quickly to the epilogue and tell you a little bit about what I think is going on right now. You may have seen there's a poster and there's the image of the book, which includes a very interesting and colorful photograph by a man named Joe Radel. I don't know him personally, but I might tell you a couple of stories about this. When I finished the book, my editor at Oxford University Press sent me a number of images which I didn't particularly like. They all looked like that one, like a travel book or like a tourist book, and pretty street scenes of Old San Juan balcony. But this one actually struck me because if you look closely, it says "Se vende," for sale, from next to the Puerto Rican flag. By the way, that is the original color of the lattice flag. You may know that there are actually 3 different colors of the official flag of Puerto Rico, depending on your political preference. This is my own preference, the light blue. But in any case, it kind of raised the question, and again, at the end of my discussion, I wanted to put it all together in a few pages, as to, was it just the colonial style apartment in Old San Juan for sale, or is it the entire island that is for sale? And so to answer that question, consider first that property values in Puerto Rico have plunged 28% since the real estate bubble in 2008 began. Total housing sales have since continued to drop, and the island's housing stock has now become a buyer's market. The average price of a new home in Puerto Rico in February 2016 was 10% less than a year before, and it's probably still declining. And other figures suggesting that, again, that there's a very critical situation with regard to housing, especially. For instance, in 2015, the island recorded the 2nd highest number of foreclosures in any state or U.S. jurisdiction, only after New Jersey. And this is partly due to, again, very high rates of migration. So when you look, for instance, at the latest census figures, you'll see that 22% of all housing units on the island were vacant in 2015. So that's about 1 out of 5, up from 13% when the economic crisis began in 2006. So I think literally much of Puerto Rico is up for sale. The Puerto Rico Planning Board, if you don't want to be depressed by these numbers, please don't go to the Puerto Rico Planning Board website, because it will give you even more ground to be depressed. So for instance, they don't project that positive growth rates of the economy will resume anytime soon. It will probably take at least 1 decade longer to recover the rates of growth of 10 years ago, given the island's tremendous public debt and other structural problems of the economy, especially after the demise of federal tax incentives under Section 936, which is one of the main causes and not the only one of the recession. So even under the most optimistic scenario, Puerto Rico's economy is likely to stagnate in the near future. Similarly, the U.S. Census Bureau forecasts that Puerto Rico's population will continue to decline, as I said before, at least until 2015. The combination of low birth and death rates will expand an already aging population, and correspondingly, the migration of large numbers of young Puerto Ricans, especially those who are college graduates in the next decade, will probably persist and continue to deplete that sector of the population. It is more difficult to predict what changes, if any, will occur in the island's political status. Much depends, as you know, on how PROMESA, the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act of 2016, affects the political party system and prevailing ideological currents on the island. In the end, of course, it is up to Congress to initiate a binding process of consultation with the Puerto Rican people about the political future. So to end, hopefully on a positive note, I want to highlight an event that took place last summer, which I think most of the people in this audience will be familiar with, which was the fact that Monica Puig, the tennis champion in Puerto Rico, who actually lives in Miami, won the gold medal in women's tennis singles at the summer 2016 Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. This unexpected athletic victory, I think, created a sense of pride and an optimistic mood wherever Puerto Ricans live across the island and the United States. Several celebrations, both spontaneous and official, took place in San Juan and throughout the island. The first time that the Puerto Rico's national anthem, La Borinqueña, was played and the single-star flag was hoisted in Olympic history. For many Puerto Ricans here and there, Puig's personal accomplishment had a broader meaning, I think, of collective hope and resiliency against all odds. And actually, Puig also seemed to suggest that she was very proud of being Puerto Rican. She actually said, "I think I united a nation, and I just love where I come from." This coming from a Puerto Rican who is half Cuban, who now lives in Miami, but still has family links to the island, and again is very proud to be here. So I'll end on that note, and thank you again for your kind attention and invitation to Centro, and I hope you enjoy reading the rest of the book.
Thank you, Jorge. Questions, comments? Yes, Jorge.
As a Puerto Rican clinician, I would be very interested in hearing your impressions about the medical and healthcare infrastructure on the island, considering that now you have an increasing number of older people, and of course with aging there is the onset of a whole host of chronic illnesses. And also the fact that I believe that more than 500 medical specialists, particularly physicians, have come to the United States.
Yeah, I think there are 4 or 5 issues in your question, but interestingly, I did include some, address some of those issues, of course not in to the extent that I think you want me to, but Zika, of course, is one of the major issues in Puerto Rico, and it has really devastated the island in the last few years. I wasn't planning to write on this, but then when I was writing, my editor asked me, you have to write about Zika. So I did look at some of the numbers. The decreasing capacity of the Puerto Rico Health Department to attend to these very serious epidemics is quite clear. The funding has been cut severely and will probably continue to be cut. So that's mentioned in the book, although not developed to a very large extent. Part of the problem, of course, yes, is the exodus of medical personnel and nurses in particular. I think I included an estimate by the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Puerto Rico, which suggests that about a third of all its members have left the island in the last decade or so. Many of them end up in Florida, but also in places throughout the United States. So yeah, I mean, and then aging will contribute to this very difficult situation. Puerto Rico is now, along with Cuba, I would imagine the oldest population in the Western Hemisphere, even older than the United States in terms of percentage of people over 65. So with the growing number of people, young people of working age who are leaving, this dependency rate is going to be even more severe. And yes, I mean, that those demographic and economic issues together forecast a very difficult problem for the island.
So I hear skilled nursing facilities, that is, nursing homes are virtually non-existent on the island.
They weren't too extensive before the crisis, but I think even now it's even worse.
Thank you. Other questions? Comments? Yes.
Hi. I'm thinking about the connection between national identity and the current economic situation, right? And I'm particularly interested in hearing your take on the fact that recently, recently pro-statehood people in Puerto Rico are said to have increased in numbers, right? In the last couple of decades. On the other hand, recently, it was the anniversary of the 1917 citizenship in Puerto Rico, American citizenship in Puerto Rico. So we expected, some of us expected like a big pro-statehood celebration of that fact, right? Apparently, it passed sin pena ni gloria, right? The 1917. It was a big thing. It's a centenario, right? So I'm wondering if you think the current crisis has something to do with it, or what's your take on it, given your work on national identity and cultural identity?
Well, I think Edwin Melendez was saying that they're actually doing more events here in New York than they are in Puerto Rico, but not celebrating them, but just commemorating the anniversary. There are a couple of responses that I can elaborate to your question. First, I don't think that the statehood movement has yet achieved a majority of the voters in Puerto Rico. There's no evidence of that. In fact, the last plebiscite, as you might remember, was very confusing because it had the two questions, and then the first question, yes, the majority of the electorate did believe that the current status of Puerto Rico, defined as a territorial status, was not what should be changed. And then the second question was, what would you support? And then statehood did not gain a majority in that second. I think it was 40-something%. So I believe actually that statehood and Commonwealth have reached a stalemate. And again, independence is a small minority, but there's no clear majority, I don't think, in any of the recent plebiscites. Of course, the elections are a different thing, and the fact that a governor from one party wins doesn't necessarily mean that people vote for the parties. And I think what happened now was that people were voting against the prior governor. And of course, the prior governor was elected because there was a negative vote. So there you have it. So my way of understanding these issues, which I try to explain, again, very succinctly in this book, but I've elaborated elsewhere, is to distinguish between cultural nationalism and political nationalism. So political nationalism in Puerto Rico is clearly not a majority option, but I think cultural nationalism is, even among statehood supporters. So for instance, the issue of language, for many years, all political parties have agreed that Spanish should be the main language on the island, and even the term, the old statehood term, estadidad jíbara, the sort of peasant statehood that Luis Ferré elaborated in the 1960s, comes back often in these discussions because they don't want to become American in the sense of culture and language. They want to join the American Union, so they say, because they want to have rights and so on. Now, in the current situation, in the economic situation and crisis, I think all of these forces are now sort of in flux. And for instance, for the first time, there was a poll conducted, a survey of Puerto Ricans in the United States, asking them for their preferences. And this is the first time that I have seen a majority vote in favor of statehood and a minority vote in favor of Commonwealth. And it may have to do with, again, these crises, both the economic crisis and the political crisis that are going on. And of course, the interventions that the federal government has made into situations, the U.S. Supreme Court especially, making it more difficult for Commonwealth supporters to continue to advocate for the idea that Puerto Rico is autonomous. So this, decreasing autonomy, I think, is reaching a point in which many Commonwealth supporters, the old guard, may be moving to the statehood camp. But again, it's very early, I think, to know.
Can I follow up very quickly on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess what surprises me is that even though there's a distinction, and I read the Nacional by then, right? And I love the distinction between cultural nationalism and political nationalism. But on the other hand, I think part of the reason the pro-independence movement has not been able to coalesce into a major movement in Puerto Rico is that both Commonwealth and pro-statehood folks value their citizenship, their American citizenship so highly. So I guess that's why I was so surprised when I didn't see a big brouhaha over the anniversary, right, in Puerto Rico. And I wonder if you think that precisely in spite of the crisis, cultural nationalism may be not only strong and good, but also on the rise, in opposition to the sort of perceived affront from the U.S. Through the imposition of the Junta de Control Fiscal.
Yeah. I think it may be, but again, it's a little early to know exactly in terms of actually doing research or conducting field work on it.
Excuse me, can you talk into the mic?
Yeah.
And I have somebody, yes, and then I see you also.
Yes, I just want to know, how can we keep talking about Commonwealth when it had been said once again that the Commonwealth per se does not longer exist, that we are a colony. So how can we keep perpetuating the term in our discussion? It takes us nowhere. So I'm just wondering, how is that discussion taking place in our island when we have been told by the establishment of the junta that they are the ones that are ruling now the island, that we are a colony, that whatever they told us before, that we were a commonwealth, that was a lie, and that we have to accept that from now on. So how can we merge that new reality with our existence in Puerto Rico?
I think that's a good point. In fact, recently I know that the Puerto Rican Association of Historians and its president has proposed rethinking even the periods that we usually, and in fact I'm guilty of that. When I was trying to organize the chapters, I did have pre-1952 and post-1952, and along the lines that you were arguing for, the association is proposing seriously that we rewrite our history books so that we don't make a sharp break when the Commonwealth begins, because again there are continuities. I think at the same time it is the official name of the government of Puerto Rico, and there are some differences between that government and the government of the states or independent countries, but still, I mean, clearly something has happened in the last few months that, yes, I sympathize with your thoughts about reimagining, what Puerto Rico is like, and perhaps after all, because of the clearly colonial structure that has been reimposed on the island, then we might, begin to think about new ways of approaching it.
Yes.
I started, I've been in the broadcast industry for many years, I'm now retired, but when I started in 1980, I started...
Yeah, I had several shows that we did, first at ABC, then at NBC, with regard to the status of Puerto Rico. And I always had a representative of the pro-independence, the Commonwealth, and the statehood parties, always. And every year we did another story. I actually went to Puerto Rico, interviewed the governor during the plebiscite, the whole thing. Then this is many, many years ago. I'm now retired, 7 years, and we still have that situation. But what strikes me, and with all due respect to everyone who is either pro-statehood or Commonwealth or independence, you're looking at an island that is dying. You're looking at an island that economically is hurting. The United States seems to be, the Congress of the United States seems to be holding back. Nothing is being done about the Jones Act. Nothing is being done about the economy, the fact that, I just came back from Florida with a friend. I traveled with a friend who always loved Puerto Rico, loved it with all her heart. She's retiring now and bought a place in Florida because Puerto Rico is not an option. So I know you've written a book and we have a history, but what do you foresee with regard to the future of our island? Does it matter whether you're Commonwealth, independence, or statehood when people are hungry? they have no housing, they have no food. I have relatives there that have no medical coverage, and it's very disheartening.
Yes, I agree, and I think in your own question you have some of the responses, and at the end of the presentation I tried to forecast, again, decreasing population, continuing economic crisis. I can't speak up more. I mean, what, like this? Yes. More migration, and again, from an economic perspective, and I'll address the political issue in a moment, there doesn't seem to be an easy solution. The only constructive trends that I could look at in the past 10 years, well, actually two. One of them is tourism. Tourism has been increasing, and of course there are issues about whether you can sustain an economy long-term just focusing on tourism like many other Caribbean countries have. But that's the one bright spot in the economic statistics. There are more visitors going to Puerto Rico, so more people being employed and so on. And at least that's one area. Another interesting development that I was reading about when I was writing is the return to agriculture. Very modest, but at least, I mean, for an island that has abandoned its land and has to import, most of its basic foodstuffs, the fact that people are returning to organic agriculture and producing their own food, it's actually quite positive. The political situation, as I see it, again, it's now at a standstill. I mean, the Puerto Rican electorate doesn't seem to be pointing in one direction or another, even though I think there is growing dissatisfaction with the Commonwealth government, if that's what we want to call it, the current status. But there's no clear option as to what to do, right? I mean, again, not a majority for statehood and certainly not a majority for independence. There's a growing number of people who are trying to look at other formulas like free associated state status, but nobody really knows what that would look like, right, in concrete terms. And again, we can continue to fight about this in Puerto Rico. Another plebiscite has been talked about, but that's not going to solve the problem because in the end it's Congress, right? Congress is the one that has the plenary power, and so until Congress decides to act on it, and I agree with you, it's frustrating because Congress doesn't seem to pay attention to Puerto Rico. And so, well, there are many other issues. Cuba, for instance, in the last 2 years became the sexy topic, and everyone in Congress wanted to go to Cuba and so on, but Puerto Rico was sort of isolated from these discussions. And the current administration doesn't seem to pay any attention to Puerto Rico either. So, unfortunately, I think the situation is not going to improve in the next 10 years very substantially.
So there's been a number of decisions, judicial decisions, pointing out the lack of sovereignty of the Commonwealth. Do you think this is the federal government signaling that they no longer support the Commonwealth formula and that it's time to move on?
That's one interpretation, but I don't think it's the only one. And again, it's the Supreme Court, that has been making these decisions. So if we can only imagine what the judges are saying. Congress has not made any, explicit statements about status. And usually, as you know, the official line is that we'll do whatever the Puerto Rican people do. That's what presidents have done in the past. And then, because there is no clear majority or even supermajority for any of the status options, we're still in the same place that we were, 20, 30 years ago. Every time especially the Popular Democratic Party has asked for further autonomy, control over migration, elimination of the cabotage laws, I don't remember what the term for that, cabotage laws, nothing has happened. So my interpretation is that Congress and the federal government, in fact, prefer not to do anything about it, neither change the Commonwealth status or eliminate it. It looks like this is the, as long as it works from their perspective, then they will leave it as it is for the time.
Thank you for being here. This has been such a great talk here. My question is, given that Congress is always elected every 2 years, and you have new congressmen, and they may not know, or they may know about Puerto Rico, I always believe that Puerto Rico is like this Frankenstein that has been created by the Congress. It's like a weird science thing, and now it's becoming a hot potato, right? And my question is, given all the situation that Puerto Ricans are facing economically and politically, do you believe, based on your studies and your research, if there's going to be a change in the collective mind of Puerto Rican on the island in terms of looking towards the U.S. or the United States, in terms of increasing the numbers in terms of statehood? I believe there's going to be a plebiscite this coming May, and because of this dissatisfaction of the people from Puerto Rico with everything. What is your take? I'm curious about what is your take on that.
I would connect my response to the other question that was raised before. I think it's a little too early to know. I haven't seen anything published, no survey data that would suggest any substantial change in public opinion regarding political status preferences. That could be an interpretation. The other process, of course, is this tremendous movement of people to the island. So by voting with their feet, so to speak, they're already doing something about it. I'm not sure that there's also this criticism of people who leave the island and saying that they have become, automatically stated supporters. I don't think so. I mean, the Puerto Rican community in the U.S. is as diverse as it is on the island. But certainly by moving from the island to the mainland individually, many people do make a decision. They can't live on the island any longer. They would like to, but economic and political situations are so bad that it forces people to come to the United States. So then that raises another issue, which I know is very sensitive here and on the island, which is, what do Puerto Ricans in the U.S. have to say about this now? And the growing number of Puerto Ricans in the diaspora who have expressed their desire to do something about it, to organize, to vote, perhaps, in a plebiscite. And remember that no plebiscite on the island has included people in the United States. There have been some efforts in Congress. I remember Fortunio, when he was President Commissioner, Pierluisi also sought to incorporate Puerto Ricans living in the United States in future plebiscites. So those bills did not go through in Congress. So as of now, only Puerto Ricans on the island can participate in any kind of decision about the future of Puerto Rico.
So I'm going to get the people that haven't asked yet, and then I'll make time for all the follow-ups, okay?
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I've read some of your stuff before, and I think it's really cool. Just two really quick observations. One is, I'm not surprised that a larger number in the diaspora are going to statehood. I have these discussions with my relatives. It's within the context of living here, the way you fight for your rights is the Constitution. So that's our context. And the context down there, I think, is different. I think one thing that's required is people here talking to people over there and vice versa. There really, in terms of the political and social and economic stuff, there have to be discussions between the two groups. The second thing is that in Puerto Rico, the term colony now is just used, every which way. There's no longer a hesitancy to say the word colony. People have recognized it, certainly the stateholders do, and at least half the PPD officials are using it. So that's not an issue. And for me, the thing about the Congress not caring, they do care. Puerto Rico, despite its present problems, is incredibly important to the United States economy. The thing about the cabotage laws is that if you actually cut off the flow of goods from Puerto Rico through Florida, it's going to devastate part of the Florida economy. There's just a lot of money to be made through Walmart, Walgreens, all these groups. So it's not that there's nothing happening. It's that there's no reason for Congress to do it because they're making out like bandits. And certainly the people who are giving them contributions. Thank you.
No, thank you for the comments.
Okay, I'm coming back over here, and then to you, and then to you.
I'm going to take you back to Florida to do this session.
Good evening, Luis Reyes. I wanted to ask you the question, of the impact of the Trump administration and what, this is serious, and what it does or doesn't do, and its impact on the Puerto Rico and what we should know about it. Education, Secretary DeVos. Housing, Secretary Carson. Social Security, Medicare. Those 4 areas are very important areas, and what the government of the U.S. does or doesn't do would seem to have a great impact.
Sure. Of course, I couldn't get into all the details of the new administration, because I was writing right before the elections. And in fact, one of the major bloops of the book is that I didn't get it in time to announce the liberation of Oscar Lopez, but maybe the second edition I will update that. But of course I had to turn in the manuscript before. But anyway, let me answer the question by something that I do have some information on, and that has to do with the Trump administration's policy toward immigration and how that affects Puerto Rico. Of course, Puerto Ricans can move to the United States freely, but as I said in my presentation, Puerto Rico is also a recipient of immigrants, foreign immigrants, especially Dominican immigrants, many of whom are undocumented, and I've been looking at that situation for a long time. So for instance, under the current administration in Puerto Rico, Eduardo Batia, Senator Batia, has proposed a number of bills, I'm not sure if they have been approved yet, to protect the status of undocumented immigrants on the island, to kind of turn Puerto Rico into a sanctuary for immigrants from other places. That's an interesting situation, and in fact, the so-called the Commonwealth arrangement again allows for some local autonomy over those matters. The Puerto Rican government can't decide who comes into Puerto Rico. That's under the federal immigration law, which is again something that the Trump administration has been looking at through the executive orders. But the Puerto Rican government can decide, for instance, that all of those benefits that were mentioned before, education, healthcare, even driver's license, can be issued to people regardless of their legal status. And so that's an interesting situation. Again, I don't know if it's going to come through, but it would make Puerto Rico similar to other places in the U.S., San Francisco, for instance. I think New York also has that kind of policy now, in order to provide for equal treatment of people regardless of their legal status.
Hi, Professor Duany. It's a pleasure. I'm very happy that you're here today. It's a pleasure to meet you and hear you speak in person.
Thank you.
I've read a lot of your work on transnationalism in the Caribbean, which I like very much, although I haven't read your current book. And I have a question. Perhaps it's a bit unfair because it sounds like you wrote the book before the Promesa?
Yes. Well, no, actually it was approved last summer, so I was writing just as it was being discussed.
Oh, so you included it. I just wanted to ask you because I had a question about a comment you made that there seemed to be really no alternative to the current situation. And it seems to me, although I'm not an expert on Puerto Rican debt, it seems to me that the debt is illegitimate and odious, and a logical conclusion would be to default on the debt. And my question is there any movement in Puerto Rico demanding default as the option?
Yeah.
And I'm curious as to whether someone like you with your prestige might speak in favor of this option, which seems to me the most forthright and promising option to let Puerto Rico return to economic stability and sovereignty.
Well, I'm not an expert on the economy. Edwin Melendez is, and he's smiling there in the back, so we can ask him later what he thinks. But just a couple of thoughts. I know there was a very lively debate on the island preceding and even after Promesa was passed, and many sectors of the population opposed it very strongly. I don't think I said there was no other option. I think that, in fact, given the constraints and the way the options were considered, in the end, the only option that the federal government, meaning the Obama administration and Congress, were willing to pass was PROMESA. The local government, and you might remember Garcia Padilla actually did say that the Commonwealth government was going to default, that was unpayable. And then the local legislature also attempted to create a sort of a Creole package of ways to restructure the debt. That didn't come through either. And so in the end, I mean, looking back, not that I favor this particular option, it was the one that was available at the time. Otherwise, the results would have been even worse, I understand, because of the economic repercussions. So I would defer the issue of policy, economic policy, because that's not my area. But I do agree that the consequences of PROMESA are going to be more suffering and more economic hardship, at least in the short term, given the kinds of packages that are being put together. And also I wanted to mention, when I reviewed the early 20th century political situation on the island, I was struck by, and then 100 years later, I was struck by the similarities. I mean, Puerto Rico was then governed until 1917 by a so-called executive council, which was appointed by the U.S. president, with minor representation by Puerto Ricans. All of them were not elected. So we're back to the early 20th century classic colonial formula. And so in that regard, I also agree then with the point that after all these debates, you have gone back with PROMESA to the most direct form of colonial rule that we experienced on the island 100 years ago.
Thank you very much, Professor Duany. I was wondering, for the layman, people from other backgrounds in the arts, or if you could explain, or if it's in the book, because there were some articles, but then they seem to have just disappeared, and the question is that people said hedge funds were the cause of the problem. If you could sort of explain that in a general way.
I'm afraid not. I'm not an expert on that. And again, Edwin Melendez will probably have a lot to say about those. Hedge funds.
Okay. I do not want to sequester the event to PROMESA and the debt. But I will say a couple of things, right? First of all, the debt, there might be little parts that are illegitimate to the extent that they exceeded the constitutional limit and things like that. But like in Detroit, the judge discovered about 10%. I don't think that's the biggest problem with the debt. I think the biggest problem with the debt is the transactions that were made, the people that benefited from it, and the accountability of who were responsible for getting us there. And that if the illegitimate debt is 5–10% of the total, this will be more profound and more significant. Now, having said that, as Jorge pointed out, when the Congress made this decision, whether you support it or not, the consequences of not having some sort of bankruptcy process in place would have been disastrous, okay? Now, the control board is not doing any better, okay? So far, they haven't really renegotiated anything. Now, they have until May to do a little bit of that. Whether they're gonna get out of this or not, it remains to be seen. But having said that, the problem with not repaying the debt is that, like in Greece and Argentina and in many other places, if you want to build a road, if you want to build a school, you have to borrow money, or you have to save enough to then conduct the capital investment. And the problem with that is that international markets are unforgiving. So the reason why Greece and Argentina and many other countries actually subject to the conditions of the IMF and other powers to be, the World Bank and so forth, is because access to international capital markets is critical. So that's the situation that we are. I think the accountability of who is responsible for that debt, who's being pushed under the rug, is a more pressing issue, so that we don't go back to repeat the problems that we had before. Having said that, it's a long conversation. part of the debt, on average, the debt is worth now anything between 20 cents and 60, 70 cents, depending on what kind of debt it is. The hedge funds bought at 20 and they want 100% back. That's the problem with about maybe, I would say, anything between 15 and 20 billion dollars of the debt. But the debt is 70 billions, right? And the more important component of that debt is the one that is unseen, because it's debt that is owed to our workers, the pension funds, which is about $40 billion. So all in total is over $110 billion. Anyway, there will be more on this on May 12th. It's announced. We have a conference of the whole thing, and I don't want to go on and on because this is Jorge's event. Let's focus back on his book. And by the way, he brought some copies for sale. So if you're interested in all this, just buy the book, okay?
He will, and I'm sure he'll sign it.
And this is what happens when you try to write a book that includes economics, but
Professor, nice meeting you. Luis Diaz, Hunter College alumni class of '96. So I was reading recently, right? The same way you mentioned how, like, the popular part of PPD, like, aren't they trying to push to just get more autonomy and maybe move, like, change the maritime laws? Because, from what I've read, if we were to, like, make adjustments in the maritime laws, it would give Puerto Rico more autonomy so they could negotiate their international routes instead of having a boat deposit merchandise in the Port of Miami, then sent to San Juan. Because what I also read is now that Prof became governor, there's a secretary in Congress who's pushing for statehood, and the way they have it listed is like, come May 2025, like, Puerto Rico will instantly become a state. It's just gonna, even though with the plebiscites and stuff and things of that nature, it's just like, this is what we asked, and then at the end of the day, it sits on Congress' desk and they decide what's gonna happen. But isn't the PPD party trying to push that type of agenda where they'll get more autonomy to remove that, ships depositing their merchandise in the Port of Miami?
what I would say about that is that I think the Popular Democratic Party is internally divided, split into two main camps. The more traditional sector that wants to remain a Commonwealth, whereas there's a growing share of populares who are pushing for more like an associated republic, soberanistas and estadolibristas, and and it looks like the two camps are almost equal in strength, and especially now that they have lost again the governorship and that they are sort of reimagining what kind of Commonwealth they want or what kind of Estado of República Asociada they want. It seems that the party seems to be in disarray, has been for some time. And so, for instance, going back to the last plebiscite, if you look at the numbers, clearly there was a sector of the electorate, the popular electorate, that wanted to culminate or to improve, enhance, I think is a word that they would use, the Commonwealth status. But again, historically, since 1952, no attempts to perfect the Commonwealth status have really been successful, neither for the cabotage law, nor immigration control, nor other kinds of aspects. And so again, I think that will require that sector of the political party to reinvent themselves and see how they will face the crisis in the future.
Thank you.
So one last question here, and then we're going to let Professor Duany have some time to chat with you.
Hi, my name is Irma Lehman. I would like to know, what did you hope to accomplish by writing this book? Do you try to convince the reader to go one way or the other on any of the issues that we have discussed tonight?
The simple answer is no.
That's the ultimate
No, I don't have a particular. And in fact, I should have mentioned before about the cover that some of the covers that were proposed to me had very clear political implications. So, for instance, One of them had Pedro Albizu Campos in one of the old San Juan sort of classic. And I like that picture myself, but I didn't want to include it in the cover because, of course, Pedro Albizu Campos is very much a political figure and is associated with a particular program, independence and so on. So I don't take a stance as far as I can tell. I mean, I do have my opinions, and you may have seen some of my own preferences, but I don't propose any particular way of going forward, except again as an academic and looking at the literature and the evidence. I do, for instance, I did say earlier, and I put it in writing as well, that at this point the political landscape of Puerto Rico is stagnant, that there's no majority for either Commonwealth or statehood, and again that independence is a very small minority. So I will leave it to the politicians and the policymakers to see whether there are any practical implications. Now I have to say, in general, as I read the other books in this series, the idea is to, again, reach a general public, which normally would not come to events like this or read the books that we write, to make it more available. And then if they want to read a little more on the history of tobacco, for instance, they will read Teresita Levy's book, which is cited in the references, and other works that are more specialized. But again, in this kind of work, I think it's a challenge because you have to write, again, as I said before, without footnotes, the language that you use hopefully is more accessible to a reading public. It's not Puerto Rico for dummies, but it is targeted at an educated audience that is curious about Puerto Rico, and perhaps then they will come to Centro and know more about the experience of Puerto Rico and the diaspora.
The wonderful thing about doing an event about Puerto Rico is that we could be here for 10 hours, and it still wouldn't be enough time. But we're not going to do that tonight. So I would like to thank Professor Jorge Duany for being with us and sharing his work with us. Thank you to all of you for being here, and buy the book, and Jorge will sign it. Thank you.